started. So welcome to the UC Master Gardeners of Butte County. Our workshop is on companion planting. Thank you all for being here today. I get the honor to introduce Joyce Hill. She has been a UC Master Gardener of Butte County for the past 3 years. She's been a gardener her whole life. She started her grandparents teaching her, and now it's come full circle to where she's now teaching her grandchildren how to garden. So you guys are in for a treat having Joyce as your presenter today. She is a retired classroom teacher from the Department of Education at UC Santa Cruz. She spent 15 years supporting teachers to use school gardens to teach science in schools. And she has done work at the Chadwick Garden at UC Santa Cruz, where she taught the teachers the concept of gardening and science. I will turn the presentation over to Joyce.
Hope it's not recording.
And also today, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box, and I will make sure that Joyce gets them and sees them. And your microphones will be muted, but there'll be a time for question and answers at the end where we will unmute the microphones. Okay, Joyce, take it away.
All righty. So I am going to just talk for a minute. First, I have to apologize. I have a big noisy lab here, and she loves to bark at people walking by and dogs. So in advance, I just want to apologize. She hears everybody's voice and she's quite excited. But just in case you hear a dog bark, I apologize. If you could take a moment just to look at that first slide here, just about the microphones and the recording afterwards. This will be available on the YouTube channel. So it is nice because we've had actually quite a few people checking out the YouTube channel for past workshops. This is a new endeavor. We hope not forever, but it is actually been quite nice for folks that can't make it, can't travel the distance, for people out of the area checking out the workshops. And so it's offered an opportunity to provide public education in a different forum, but we definitely are typically used to teaching in person. So we all miss that and hope to get back to it soon. So with that, I'm going to turn off my video so we can concentrate there on the slides. There we go. So, and you may want to go to, I've figured out after a few times that you have to go to thumbnails so you can actually see the slide and not everybody on the right hand side. So let's see here. There we go. So this workshop is on companion planting. It is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Something that I've been experimenting and exploring for probably the last, I think since 1988. I started to get more serious about what is all this about. And again, it comes to my exposure at the, if you're familiar with Alan Chadwick and John Jevons, working on biointensive French gardening and all the experiments. We had a Alan Chadwick garden at the UCSC campus where they trained interns. And that was my first kind of awareness of the concept, the idea of not planting things separately, for actually planting them in a coordinated fashion in order to benefit one another. So we're going to start with exactly what does companion planting mean? If you were to Google and look it up, you'd see lots of different definitions. This one is one of my favorites. This is from John Jevons' book, The Synergistic Planting of Crop Combinations. Synergistic having to do with that there's mutual benefit for the plants and flowers and herbs that you grow together. And the scientific definition is the placing together of these plants that have complementary physical demands. So this workshop, we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of those particular physical situations that you might want to think about as you plan to put combinations of plants together. And then we're going to look at some different resources and methods that you may want to consider as you get started. So the first place I like to always begin is we have to think about what does our own garden look like. So if you were to reflect and just take a moment in person, it would be great to have a chance to talk about this. But I'd like you just to take a moment and think about your own garden. This is a little snippet from my garden this last summer. I had to put a gate to keep the dog out of there, but it's just really important in gardening to keep observing, keep noting, and thinking about what do you see happening, and really get a close look at where are things doing well, and maybe there are perhaps areas of your garden that aren't doing so well. And think about what might be going on. What's the cause of that? Maybe it is an insect. Maybe there's another situation that's going on. Could be light. It could be the soil. It's not compatible. And one thing over my many years of gardening, probably 30, 40 years now, is that the most important part of gardening is to find the proper environment for every individual plant. A plant will do well if it's in the environment where it's getting the soil it prefers, the light that it prefers, the watering that it prefers. And so we have to think also the next level of that is what combinations of plants can we put together that will mutually benefit each of those plants. So I start with these prompts and these questions just as a place to begin thinking about your particular garden, your context. Some of the benefits, and these you may or may not be aware of, these are just sort of probably the consensus on benefits of companion planting. There has been a lot of research. Unfortunately, it's ongoing, but the research has focused more on the aspect of thinking on large scale farming practices and those things that are conducive to that situation, not so much for the home gardener. So a lot of what research is out there is anecdotal from gardener observations and reporting, and then over time, there has been research done to kind of focus more on specific aspects. In my area, I came from Monterey County, there was a lot of work from UCSC scientists working with local farmers to incorporate more of these strategies as a way to get away from chemical use in order to control insects and so forth. So let's just kind of talk about some of these aspects of the benefits of companion planting. The first one, physical protection or support, and that can refer, if you think about it, physical protection could be planting taller plants that provide some shade for perhaps plants that are a little more tender and they need less sun. It could also be plants that need some structural support. So one combination that comes to mind is planting beans, whole beans, around corn. They use the corn as a support structure, and obviously the beans need something to hang on to, so they're benefiting from having that support there. Another would be, one thing I love to do is plant a green bean tower. I'd like pole beans in particular for this, but my grandkids like to hang out inside. It's a little teepee, but lettuce does really well growing in there, or things that don't like so much sun in the summertime, but perhaps you want to have some tender greens. So that's an example, another example of how we might use physical protection to benefit those plants. Trap cropping is when you are very intentional about planting certain plants that will trap insects that we do not want near our garden. So we might plant a crop at a distance from perhaps something in particular. I'm thinking brassica. If we're growing broccoli and cauliflower and kale, they definitely have a tendency to attract certain benefits. And then if we plant certain things away from it, they will trap those insects and keep them away from your plants. Another is that one of my favorites is, of course, attracting beneficial insects. If you take a note there to the side, this is in my perennial bed. I plant coneflower, lemon balm, that's bee balm, the bright pink, and a combination of flowers and herbs that will attract. I get lots of bees, all sorts of native bees, butterflies, flies, hoverflies, which I've learned a lot about this last summer. But these things all attract the beneficial insects we need for pollination in our gardens. And so you want to consider what kinds of plants would be conducive in your particular garden. We also want to think about what kinds of plants might deter pests. A common one, and I've read over and over in various articles about this, is marigolds. Marigolds are, they labeled them the workhorse in the garden. They have, as you know, not a very pleasant odor, but they deter pests. And so one of the most common combinations or companion groupings is tomatoes with marigolds. Also marigolds around your eggplant. But whitefly definitely is deterred by the marigolds. So that's one combination that is a pretty well-known and well-tried one. Another combination is supplying nutrients. So some of the benefits that you may want to consider is, for example,
the visual communication is really important. And you'll notice that those two come into play way more.
Oops, okay. I think that was an accidental unmute. Okay, so supplying nutrients. Supplying nutrients, there are several ways that plants can provide nutrients that support the needs of others. We look at some plants, as you know, are nitrogen fixers. That is, they collect nitrogen and it builds on the roots and it is dispersed into the soil. A common one would be, there are a lot of cover crops, my favorite being fava beans. And I grow them each year, leave the roots in the ground, move around, but legumes in general are great at supplying nutrients. On the other hand, we have certain plants that are nitrogen users. They use a high level of nitrogen, and that would be one example is corn. So again, going back to that symbiotic relationship between corn and beans, the corn needs that high amount of nitrogen. It uses lots of nutrients. The bean, being a legume, provides that. And so it is another beneficial combination is the corn and the pole bean. In that same combination, suppressing weeds, we use and we see often certain plants will, with their leaves, because they are so broad and they cover the soil, we know that weeds need sunlight. And so by planting squash, which is a very common one, all sorts of squash and pumpkins and so forth, they have a tendency to shade the soil to reduce weeds, but they also give off a chemical that helps to suppress weeds. And so one of those combinations, again, that we see often is using that, that crop in order to provide that benefit if you happen to have that aspect in your garden. Then there is the improved flavor. And I'm not sure how to measure this one. It is not quite as scientific. They say that basil helps to improve the flavor of tomatoes. Well, I love to grow basil, and it's a great combination with tomatoes in your kitchen. And so often I'll plant basil along my tomatoes, along the base. And so I'll always have a row of tomatoes and a row of basil. I don't know if that's something we can measure. However, anecdotally, people do say that it does improve the flavor. So that's one that we'll have to test. This is just an example. This is the Three Sisters, which is a very ancient practice. And I learned about 20 years ago that it's common in the Alan Chadwick garden to use Three Sisters. It's a very strategic planting of corn, the pole bean, and the squash at the base. And it is a symbiotic relationship in that, as I just shared, the squash is suppressing, so we plant that around the circle of the bean and corn. That suppresses the weeds, it keeps the moisture content, and as well, it's giving off that chemical that helps to keep the weeds at bay. So this is something that's been going on ancient, and I'm not sure how many thousands of years, but it is a very common example of companion planting. So in my experience with this and exploring it over the years, the first place, and I'm not sure where each of you are at, if it's something that you have dabbled with, or maybe you're at an expert level, the beginning place that I seemed logical for folks, if you are just getting started, is to look at charts. And so there are a lot of charts. One of the most common that I've seen, and the one that I've used since the 80s, is from John Jevons' book, How to Grow More Vegetables Than You Ever Thought Possible on Less Land, with Less Water Than You Can Imagine. I think they're on their 3rd edition of this book. I had to buy another one since the other one came apart at the seams, many times left out in the garden. This is an example of one that I downloaded. It is a poster, so as you can tell, it's very hard to see, and that's not the purpose, but just to give you an example of what you can find if you look online. What it does is it'll show a list over here on the side of vegetables, and here's a list, and it will tell you which ones benefit and are good combinations. So that one was one that I thought was interesting. I've shared with a couple groups. This is one, as you can see, it's from my well-used John Jevons book. The page came out of the book actually, because I carry it around. But this is where I started. I wanted to grow bush beans. Here are some plants that do really well. Potatoes, cucumbers, corn, do well with bush beans. What you don't want to plant, and another consideration, is what we call antagonists. And these are plants that they repel each other. It's a relationship where plants don't do well together. I found this out the hard way. I planted strawberries and then planted the next season garlic, and they did not do too well. So I wondered what was going on in that particular situation, but these are just some of the most common. There's 3 or 4 pages more, but I just wanted to show you a picture. So starting with charts and identifying some of the things that you like to grow, start with the list. If you are a vegetable grower, or perhaps you are interested more in herbs in combination with certain vegetables do very well, and flowers that oftentimes will attract certain insects that you would want to have around certain vegetables. So a suggestion would be to start with a list. Start writing down some things that you would like to grow. Then take a look at some of the charts. Following this workshop, I will send you a couple of those charts that I have as PDFs. They don't work very well on a slideshow. But if you're interested, I will send you some of those. So you start by looking at the charts and looking at those compatible and antagonistic relationships. And then also there are lists on that you will find that are specific to pests, like certain plants that you grow will repel ants, or certain aphid. And so you would want to think about that too. If you tend to have a problem with aphid, you might want to consider planting some of those plants just to decrease the amount of that particular pest. So one thing I found in doing all of this and using these charts over probably a good 25 years is that it's very complicated, because as you start to look at the table of what grows really well with something else, you look at another, you go down the chart and you look at that plant and it doesn't do well with something that did do well. Be really careful. And I found it took a lot of thinking and a lot of planning. And one thing that I would suggest strongly is that you keep track of your garden plans. Some of you perhaps have our garden journal. Botanical Interest has a nice journal you can download also. But somewhere, somehow you need to keep track of what you plant. This is a particular master gardener of ours who is an expert at recording. As you can see, she tracks over, and this keeps track over 3 years by week of your season, what you plant, what you found, and then we've added some graph papers so you can actually put your plans in there on a graph. This is what it looks like. I'm just sharing this with you. If you haven't seen it, it is a great resource. It also has week by week suggestions and things about what to consider for your garden at that particular time of year. And it's The most important aspect, though, is that it is based on our local context, just Butte County. Here is my favorite. This is my binder. I'm sharing a picture with you. I like the binder because I have about 10, 12 tabs now. So I keep track of all my maps, all my garden plans from year to year. And then I can also have pockets in there with my clear plastic where I keep my seed packets of the ones that did really well that I want to make sure I plant again. This is a photo just from before I actually started kind of moving into more serious combinations. So this is summer of 2018. My grandkids, we did a Three Sisters garden here, did quite well. I didn't realize we planted Indian corn, so it wasn't edible, but we had lots of decorative corn for Thanksgiving. But my other favorites in this garden included the tomato and basil with marigolds along the perimeter, as well as the lettuce, carrots, and green onions. And if you like radishes, they do well in there as well, in that combination. So following 2018, we're gonna take a little short time here for some questions up to this point, and then we'll talk about maybe thinking about companion planting at a different level. Are there any questions out there, Karina?
No questions in the chat box. Just one comment, and it's a yes, please, to getting the resources and graphs and charts sent out to them after.
Okay, excellent. Does anybody, if you want to put a chat question in, just feel free at any time and we'll continue on. So what we're going to talk about next is the neighborhood approach. And not only, this is a book that I picked up a few years earlier, but you know how it goes. And I didn't have time to actually get into it. Every time I looked at it, it didn't quite make sense. But then around 2018, after that summer, decided to take a serious look at it. It's written by a master gardener back east on the Cornell Cooperative Extension. And the book is titled Great Garden Companions. So what she outlines, and that I thought was actually made a lot of sense, she took the time to actually organize vegetables, herbs, and flowers in combinations that she calls neighborhoods. So they are grouped into families. And she looked at the botanical families, but also what kinds of flowers made good combinations in terms of looking at insects, nutrients, what made sense in terms of herbs to plant as well. And so she created these 6 neighborhoods. And I have been experimenting with that over the last few years. I wanted to share with you. First of all, I wanted to just give you some kind of a snapshot view of each of these neighborhoods. I have, following this, easier to read text, but I like pictures. I think pictures are worth 1,000 words. So the squash neighborhood is one of them. And in this neighborhood, the squash family includes corn and pole beans. So she grouped the family of vegetables that are compatible. And then the friends would include herbs and flowers that do well with that particular family. So in this case, you would plant borage, dill, nasturtiums, and sunflowers in this combination. So this is our first neighborhood, the squash neighborhood. As you, something that doesn't grow through the winter. So that's something to keep in mind. It is a warm season neighborhood. The next neighborhood is what's called the roots and greens neighborhood. And it consists of carrots, all the greens, onions. So the greens would include, as you can see in the photo there, kale, chard, lettuce. But as well, our friends are, I've never grown caraway, but chamomile, cleome, cosmos, dill, fennel, Iceland poppies, short aster families. So this is our second neighborhood. The third neighborhood, known as the potato neighborhood, includes potatoes and bush beans. It's really important to note the distinction that pole beans and bush beans do not get along with the same family. And so you do need to be really clear that the potatoes do not do well with pole. I learned they are antagonists with each other. So that's something to note. As well, peas. And then our friends are calendula, cosmos, daisies. As you can guess, this is more, at least in my garden, it tends to be kind of a blend, a crossover between spring, summer, and fall garden. It does pretty well. And then we have the cabbage neighborhood, which would include, in addition to cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower. You can also include lettuce, root crops in this grouping, so beets and carrots, turnips. And the friends of this group are the asters, calendula, chamomile, chrysanthemum, cosmos, marigolds, and then the herbs, rosemary, sage, and thyme. You're going to start noticing that there are certain flowers that they tend to be in almost every neighborhood, and that would be cosmos. So it's something to think about, and marigolds are in there too. The next neighborhood is our tomato neighborhood, and this family includes the tomato, pepper, eggplant, as well as some greens. So our friends, basil, cleome, cosmos again, parsley, Queen Anne's lace, and any tall aster family flower. So this would be our warm season neighborhood. All of these like it hot. And then there is one bed that is the perennial crop. So if you like to grow asparagus, strawberries, I don't grow horseradish, but rhubarb is another. These would be things that it's more or less a permanent bed. And then as you can see, it actually gets even cut off in the picture. There are quite a few friends, borage, alyssum, chives. I'm not going to read through the whole list, but there's a lot of flower and herbs that would grow in this perennial crop neighborhood. So that's a quick snapshot of the 6 neighborhoods. This is in text so that when we're going to send you a copy of this PDF, and you will be able to take a closer look at it in text. It's easier to see than my typed up pictures. So again, if you start to see a pattern, there are certain things that do really well. Borage, cosmos are in numerous neighborhoods. Right. So besides those 6 neighborhoods, something that I've been trying for summer of 2019 and 20, and is as well, I will say, is included in Sally Jean Cunningham's suggestions, is crop rotation. So essentially there are 6 neighborhoods. One neighborhood is going to stay put. It's your perennial, but the other 5 are going to rotate each year. And we do that for a number of reasons. Crop rotation is important in order for certain insects not to take home in that set of soil. That's one, is the insect consideration, but the other has to do with the soil. If I plant peas and green beans and legumes, that soil is going to be very nutrient rich. But if I'm planting tomatoes and eggplant and corn, I'm going to be depleting that soil of nutrients. And so it's important to rotate your beds and move them so that each year that soil is getting a new set of nutrients. The second strategy that I like to use is intercropping. So for example, planting, you don't need to have one bed that is strictly one plant. You can put, I sow seeds, perhaps maybe beet seeds or lettuce seeds or kale seed, and then plant my larger plants in there. So that by the time those tall plants, for example, tomatoes or eggplant, are ready at the end of the season, the bed is full, and that gives the space for the carrots and beets and so forth to continue to grow. And so I've already got a head start with those seeds starting, and the bed is never empty. It continues to be producing and growing. I also have implemented the no-till method, which is something I learned about, and that is, we were always famous for double digging and turning the soil and all, but in reality, it's better to cut your plants at the ground level, leave the roots in systems so they get a chance to decompose. They create air pockets. They also begin to be habitats and homes for different critters in the soil. And so we don't want to disturb that. Over time, the soil will improve. Each year I add straw, I add compost. There's lots of different recipes, but basically I don't pull out any plants any longer. Just cut them at the ground level and then compost the top. So my last suggestion is to just keep experimenting, trying new things and see what happens. So this is an example. This is my map of my garden beds. And it was my first try, first attempt. I decided to incorporate at this time to get a little more serious, the raised beds. And so, because I had also a bit of a gopher problem. So I built some large raised beds. Fortunately, when Orchard was going out of business, they had a huge sale. So I got some cedar kits to put together raised beds, put them in, and then I started the neighborhood approach. And for me, it was easier on my map to have these little Post-its with the different neighborhoods that I was going to try. I did not attempt all 6, but the ones my favorite, the squash, tomato, and the carrot neighbors were the first to go in. So here's an example of some of my plantings. And as you can see, some beneficial insects right there. Ladybug in the garden was a sign that I was on the right track.
Joyce,
Next.
can I interrupt you for just 1 second?
Sure.
I'm just interrupting because I think this question is relevant right now. It is, how is companion planting impacted with raised beds and being in limited space?
Good question. I think that is a good question. I would say it definitely is impacted by the soil that is in those raised beds. I have great soil. I have the nice sandy loam, beautiful soil. So I was disappointed to convert and move to the raised beds. And when I started looking around after I put the beds, I realized I had to fill them. And I started looking around. It was very hard to find anything. I found some raised bed mix, but it didn't have any structure to it. I used it the first season and I wasn't happy with that. So then I went to the worm farm and filled it. And I think depending on what you actually fill your beds with, knowing raised beds need to be added to annually. Once you get your system going, you can use your homemade compost. But initially, to start with, the soil is going to be critical. I used some of the garden soil, throwing that in and mixing it with the worm compost from the worm farm. But I think it definitely had a lot to do with the production the second year. As you can see, the soil is dark. It looks great. It had good structure, water retention. Everything did quite well. And I hope that answers your question, Karina.
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. So taking a look, this was early in the season, starting some leeks and carrots and chard, a combination that does well. But you can see the garden map that I created. I actually had a tree die, so I got to expand my garden. The tree is gone, and so this whole area, I planted a couple more fruit trees and made like a perennial corner there with some herbs and flowers that do well in the garden. Trying to surround my fruit and my beds with beneficial. So this was my second try, and the season did quite well. As you can see, this is looking now at that dead tree area. Tomatoes, basil, marigolds, and then that herb corner did really well. It took off. Some of the harvest from the garden, but all in all, I would definitely say seeing the benefits of the careful planning and carrying out of putting combinations of plants together. Here are some of the resources that are available that I would highly recommend. I got this version of John Jevons' book at the bookstore recently because my original was quite old. I don't think it's been updated too much, but it was just falling apart. So John Jevons is the director at Ecology Action up in the Bay Area. I think they're located in Berkeley. He's well known for his writing, and they have a garden up in that area north of San Francisco as well, and growing biointensive based on the work of Alan Chadwick. But companion planting is just one of the strategies that they promote in the book. This is the book with the neighborhoods, and oops, sorry about that. Let's go back. Sally Jean Cunningham, this is her system, and it's actually referenced in quite a few articles that I read and came across online looking at companion planting and trying to dig up as much as I could. So it is definitely a system. It's more intense, and if you are serious about thinking how I might produce more in my garden year-round and thinking about combinations that it depends on your gardening interests. But if you are a serious gardener, this is something you may want to think about. If you want to just dabble and you just like to grow a few things in the summertime, you know, pumpkin, squash, tomatoes, then you may want to just consider growing one of the neighborhoods and not doing the full 6. This summer, I'm hoping to implement all the neighborhoods. I have enough beds because I've increased my beds, but it's something that definitely takes a lot of planning and thinking, and still working on that plan. So a couple other resources that have been extremely helpful. These are, I found online. I don't have the books, but I have a couple articles that I will send. One is from ATRA, Sustainable Agriculture. It's a program through the National Center for Appropriate Technology. And they have a great article on planting and botanical pesticides, concepts, and resources. And they have their chart with companions that they recommend that's compiled from various lists. But I would send you that article in addition to that other green chart, which you can print and look at a little closer. So if you have questions, this would be a good time. This is some of our contact information, and if you have questions ever, there is a hotline, email address, and a phone number. You can send questions. If you have a question about a pest or a combination, feel free to send an email, or like I say, leave a voicemail. I don't think anyone is in the office answering the phone at this time as we normally do.
All right, Joyce, there are a few more questions coming in the chat box.
Yeah.
Is there a specific order for succession of neighborhoods?
Good question. In the information I'm going to send you, I will include a map. I'm going to kind of escape from this PowerPoint so I can see you. So I'm going to send a map that has the rotation. It isn't really important that it follows in that sequence. For example, if you have grown tomatoes in one area, you're going to want to think about rotating them to the next area that perhaps was growing legumes. I would think about nutrients in the soil, and you obviously want your plants to do best, so they would go where the soil has been fortified, let's say. And so think about that sequence. There isn't a set formula for rotation, however, in her systems.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, can you discuss plants that repel ants, beetles, aphids, and white flies?
Okay, well, we know that white flies would definitely be marigolds. Hold on, let me get my list. This little chart has, there we go. So for ants, this is one of the charts that's coming to you. For ants, mint, tansy, and wormwood would be plants that repel. And then white fly would be basil, nasturtium, peppermint, thyme, and wormwood. And what was the other?
Beetles?
Beetles? Japanese beetles or Mexican bean beetles?
There's no just kind of beetles. Is there a difference for the types of?
There is. So for Mexican bean beetle, it would be garlic, marigold, nasturtium, rosemary. For the Japanese beetle, it would be catnip, chive, garlic. So you see garlic in both, and nasturtium, and marigold, tansy, and white geranium.
Okay. And the last one was for aphids.
Yes, aphids, most aromatic herbs, which would include catnip, chives, clover, coriander, fennel, garlic, larkspur, marigold, mustard, nasturtium, peppermint, and spearmint. So again, I know I'm reading through these. I'm going to send this chart, which is in that article, that sustainable agriculture article. And it's very helpful. They have several lists, but in particular for pests, what kinds of things you can plant to deter those pests.
Great, that is great. Those resources sound amazing. A couple more questions. And moving away from pests, it is, what type of straw do you use to keep down weeds and increase moisture?
Good question. Let's see here. So I have experimented because I also have chickens. Sorry about that. I'm trying to escape here so I can see you. Okay. So there we go. I see you, Karina. Okay. So what kind of straw? I've tried a couple types of straw. I use oat straw. However, I do get a lot of greens popping up this time of year, which I feed to the chickens. That's okay. But I found with rice straw, which I bought the last time before, it didn't break down quite as well. So what I like to do around through my bed, you know, in between the beds and paths, I use, when I see a tree company chopping down a tree and shredding it, I just ask them to drop their load in my front yard. And I use that. So all that mulch that you see, there's some straw in there because the chickens are to the right of that bed. But I tend to use shredded bark. It breaks down a lot slower, and just put annually another layer on a couple inches.
But you don't use bark inside your raised beds.
No, there's so many plants growing in there. I use some straw just lightly, but not very much. And it's the oat straw.
Okay.
Yeah, just to keep the moisture more than weeds.
Okay. 2 more questions. One asking to please go back to the slide with the YouTube address on there.
Okay, sure. Let's see.
And then another one is a comment, and it says, I've heard that yarrow and fennel are great for bringing in predator insects that eat aphids.
Yarrow and fennel. Let me see. Hang on. Let me check my list. Yeah, and so fennel is kind of a funny one. According to the information that I've been using for a long time, fennel, it's always said to plant away from the garden, that most plants dislike it. It is beneficial, so I keep it growing, but I actually have it in a big tub growing, and then I can kind of move it around the garden, but I don't plant it in the bed like I do parsley and basil and some of the other herbs. And what was the other one? The fennel and
Yarrow.
yarrow. Okay. Let me check my list here. Yeah. So planting along borders, paths near aromatic herbs enhances essential oil production, and it is definitely a beneficial close by. It's just the fennel. There's something about fennel, and so I tend not to put that one in there.
Okay. Okay. And then for limited space, I think you kind of touched on that about the timing of plants where you can intercrop. But do you have any other information about companion planting that benefits limited space?
Well, it is possible, and actually there's a website that I came across where if you have a small garden, say in a patio, when I used to live in an apartment or condo, you can put certain beneficial plants like flowers or herbs into pots, and you can put them near your vegetables. So you can just dedicate your bed space for vegetables and then surround it with beneficial flowers, whether it be basil or cosmos or marigolds, and plant those things that would be compatible with what you planted in your bed. So that's one suggestion, and so that it's possible in any kind of situation.
That's great. That's a great idea. One more question that just came in. Oh, is it required to sign up for the YouTube presentations?
No, you can access, it'll take maybe a day or two for them to upload this recording to YouTube, but you just go to our Butte County Master Gardener website and then scroll down on the left and you can click on the YouTube channel, and all the workshops are posted there. So there's a number of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, that looks like all the questions that are in the chat box. If anyone has any more questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or type them into the chat box, and we'll just give a few more minutes for that.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure to let people know too, we have the workshops posted now.
And you are getting many thank yous coming in.
Oh, thank you. Something near and dear to my heart. I love talking about companion plants and experimenting. So,
can you tell us where we can get the Butte County Master Gardeners book that you showed?
yes, there are a couple ways. If you are in Chico locally, it's sold through Magnolia.
Ah, okay.
You can also order it online. It is a $5 shipping because we have to mail it in a package. Unless you're in town, I do deliveries. I'm in charge of the garden guide sales. So if you're in town, I'll do a drop off at your house if you order it online, and it's also on our Master Gardener webpage.
Thank you.
About the shredded bark, you said that you wouldn't put it in your raised beds. Why is that?
I wouldn't, because the shredded bark, if I put it in my raised beds, first of all, it starts as it breaks down to create this, what's the word, a network, and it creates a fungus as it grows together. So you don't want to disturb that. And so in my garden, I don't want to take the energy from the soil to help break down that shredded bark. I would want that shredded bark I use for more moisture retention, for weed suppression, just to keep it clean so it's not muddy in the paths. But in terms of my raised beds, I would want to use something for either straw or maybe even newspaper, something else to keep the moisture, suppress the weeds, protect plants or seedlings that are coming up from birds. But I wouldn't put the bark in there, because bark is more of a long-term, slow breakdown kind of an item.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank each of you, and I wish you well. If you have any questions, I would love to hear how your gardens are going. I will send the email list of participants. I'll send you a copy of the PowerPoint, and you'll also get the article that I referred you to and the chart so that you can look at it a little closer. And if there's anything else that I talked about that I didn't share with you, feel free to contact me. I can send you, I don't think I have my email address. If you'd like it, I can give that to you really quick. My email is mg, for Master Gardener, granny18@gmail. So feel free to contact me if there's something that you have a question about, or if I did not send in the follow-up email. mggranny, so there's 2 G's, 18@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good day. Good luck.
Yeah.
Thanks.